Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It actually isn't so weird. I actually was down in Lima at the meetings that were around the Conference of the Parties for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and I spent most of my time at the Global Landscapes Forum, which has been going on now for several years in the middle of the COP, and so I actually have some latest stuff to announce from that. Now let me see what this is sort of an odd presentation. Is this the way it's supposed to look for me in terms of this is the current one and this shows me the next one?
Yeah, next one.
Aha, okay, I got it, all right, good. So I wanted to move, I thought Martina gave a great talk, and she really talked about sort of these components of agricultural systems and how components of agricultural systems can be evolving to deal with the climate change challenge. And I'm going to take you to a different kind of a scale, looking at the whole landscape scale. And the first part of my talk is just going to say a little bit about what we mean by that and what's happening and the sort of the level of energy around a landscape approach that is coming out, particularly in the agriculture and climate change world. To say a little bit more about what we're learning about what integrated landscape management is, then what does it mean to do that in a way that's climate smart? And then give a little bit of suggestions about operationalizing that and some of the questions that we have. And I'll give you an example from Africa to describe it. But it's a thought piece in terms of encouraging you to think a little bit more broadly about the whole challenge of climate change and landscapes and all the moving parts that are needed in order to make it work. I think Martina, reiterated the fact that there's multiple tools in the toolbox, and I think this is going to be less detailed, but a little bit broader than what she had presented on that. So, should I just use the little arrow? I'll just use the little arrow. That would be fine. One of the things I think that's really changed in the way we think about agriculture in the world in the last 20 years is we no longer think of it just as the source of food production. We're realizing now that the extent of crop and livestock production around the world is so large, and the expansion has been so dramatic, particularly in the last 100 to 150 years, that most of the world's major watersheds, many of the world's most important biodiversity habitats are actually in and around agricultural areas, so that our production systems need to generate biodiversity and biodiversity habitat. They need to generate watershed function. They need to generate, and now they need to also generate a role in climate change stabilization in terms of the massive land and resource base in and around agricultural areas. So this is has been for some time leading us to think differently about agriculture, and I think the question of climate change has absolutely accelerated this rethinking about the role of agriculture. And I think there's three really big reasons. The first one is the level of impact. It is the sector that is going to be most impacted by climate change in many parts of the world, particularly in large parts of Africa. That climate change has started. You're seeing dramatic differences in systems and rainfall patterns and all sorts of things, and the projections are quite worrisome about the degree of risk. There's many things that we don't know, but we know there's a lot of changes. And a lot of the areas, I have worked more in the developing world, but a lot of the areas that have been historically, in the last 50 years, the stable agricultural producers that did get good yields almost every year, or they had irrigation, are now starting to behave more like what we used to call marginal lands, where they'll have several years of crop failures because of either very erratic behavior that affects, what time the maize is maturing so that it fills, this type of thing, or from a much higher level of frequency of various kinds of natural disasters, whether that's floods or droughts or winds or hail or whatever is just occurring more frequently and therefore making it difficult for farmers to recover from it. So there's a huge challenge both at the production level and at the level of trying to reduce the incidence or impacts of the flooding, reduce the impacts or incidence of the droughts. So what can we do, and how can we also manage the systems at farm scale and higher scale in order to have some backup when things don't go well, so that the system is resilient. So there's a big push now on the idea of resilience. The second aspect is, as was already mentioned here, is that agriculture is a very significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's actually very difficult to think of the world being able to meet targets for emissions reduction without having very large reductions from agriculture. And that's not only, as Martina was saying, the nitrous oxides and the carbon dioxide that comes from the degradation of soils. We're also seeing massive, and have been for some time, seen massive biomass degradation below ground and above ground in rangelands, wetlands, all sorts of other kinds of parts of the agricultural land use mosaic, which continues then to generate emissions. And so that process really needs to be, it's just as important to do that as it is to do something about our cars. And at the same time, at this point in time with the current technology, the only, to my understanding, and maybe there's been something new, the only large-scale potential that we have for sequestration that's economically viable now is through the land use sector. It's through sequestration in agricultural systems, and forest systems, and rangeland systems, and wetland systems, and peat systems, et cetera. It's pulling carbon out of the air. So that one of the big challenges is recarbonizing our land, basically our vegetative spaces, both our agricultural systems and in and around our agricultural systems and our forest mosaics. So we've had a lot of trouble. I just came from the Climate Change Convention. Really a lot of trouble getting the ministers of environment who have energy on the mind to ever think at all about agriculture. They finally got forests and reducing deforestation very centrally on the agenda of the climate change group, and they've been playing around with one thing or the other thing or the other thing on reducing emissions, but really have done almost nothing on the role of agriculture in terms of transforming our agricultural systems themselves to become sinks rather than sources for greenhouse gases, to deal with issues of rangelands, to deal with other kinds of issues. It's really just beginning. So those are sort of the three things that are driving. And because of this, I think that over the last 10 years, you have absolutely seen an evolution toward a recognition that this is not a farm-by-farm process, but this is something that if we're going to have real big impacts on adaptation, real big impacts on emissions reduction, and real big impacts on sequestration, we have to start talking about initiatives that are happening at very large scales. So we spent a lot of years trying to figure out how do we measure carbon changes in an agricultural system at a plot level. Very useful stuff, but that's not the level we need to care about. We need to care about very large regions, the whole state of Virginia. What's happening to the carbon balance? What's happening to all the agricultural lands in Virginia? What's happening to the carbon balance? And other greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm just going to list here for you some of the initiatives that are going on right now at the global or regional level that are pushing these kind of more integrated landscape approaches to it at one. One of it is that the Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation, RED, which was sort of the new instrument for forestry to reduce deforestation, has firmly moved to RED Plus. With the plus being reducing degradation, but the plus also moving towards, officially in the UN, a landscape approach, recognizing that you can't really stop deforestation unless other land uses in the area have some sort of a coordinated planning process as well. So they're starting to try to marry the forest sector with the agriculture sector. Some of these are coming off at something called a jurisdictional, where they're putting boundaries and having specific regions or districts say we're going to keep deforestation to a certain level, but then looking at all the land uses within it. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Bond Challenge for landscape restoration. This is an effort that's been made over the last couple of years, where there was originally a commitment for 150 million hectares of originally forested or wooded lands that would be restored globally. Recently in New York in September, there was an increase in the commitments that were made, and these are country by country commitments. The United States has a commitment, I think, for something someone told me. I not verified this, that we have a commitment for 11 million hectares that we're going to restore in the United States as part of this Bond Challenge. So different countries are doing that. And I have some numbers down here. When I was in Lima, there was a launch by 8 Latin American countries that had jointly made a commitment for 20 million hectares by 2020 that are going to be restored. And this is restoration of forests, but it's also restoration of rangelands in some countries. It's restoration of very degraded soils in some of these countries. It's restoration of watershed areas in other countries. But the agricultural piece, the livestock production piece was central in many of those. You also, this past July, I was part of an initiative that was put together in Africa with representatives from 20 African countries and the African Union putting together an African Landscapes Action Plan, which is, they were talking in Lima about evolving that into an African alliance for resilient landscapes because the degradation problem is so widespread. We're improving yields through technology at not as fast a pace as the water and soil and vegetation resources are actually being degraded. So this is being seen now as a matter of priority. There's a new Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture that was announced back in September. It's not primarily a landscape approach, but a landscape approach is part of that, is seen as part of the solution. There's a lot of work going on in many countries. I don't know if we're doing it in the U.S. so much, but of a new trajectory for agricultural green growth. That agricultural development strategies themselves should be designed to co-produce benefits for the environment, for climate, et cetera. And it's a strategy. There are places in the United States doing it. I don't think we have a policy around it. There's also the Convention to Combat Desertification, the CCD, a couple of years ago established a global goal for zero net land degradation, much of that being agricultural and pasture land. And where they are with that is not so clear, but even the bond challenge and other things are going to contribute to it. So I just wanted to put that out there to say that this is not like a conceptual thing. This is something that people are seeing about the need to operate at scale. But it's more than just a scale thing, and it's way more than climate. And in fact, as I'll say later, climate's been driving the policy interest in this, but it's not what's driving action on the ground. What's driving action on the ground is the challenge of degradation. It's the challenge of many, many billion more people on the same land base that need to produce food, and they need water, and they need biodiversity, and they need pollinators, and they need recreational areas, and they need tourist areas, but it's the same land base that we're sharing. And the old model of divvying up land and saying that's just for agriculture, that's just for tourism, that's just for wildlife, that's just for watershed protection, in most of the world it's simply non-viable. There's too much pressure on the resource base to try to do that. And we now have a number of documented examples that are really amazing and exciting, one of which is this transformation in Ethiopia, whereby having a very systematic, multiple-pronged investment program in landscapes to restore the irrigated areas and the rain-fed areas and the upland areas and the forest areas and the riparian areas jointly in a sensible kind of a sequence. In periods between 7 and 15 years, you had big communities in some of the most degraded parts of Ethiopia where people were petitioning the government to allow them to leave because they couldn't grow enough food. They were receiving food aid from the World Food Program 4 years out of 5 because of the extreme degradation, the extreme lack of water. Through these landscape restoration programs, these multi-component programs have tripled and quadrupled agricultural yields. They've through a massive sort of micro watershed water harvesting system, raised water tables to the point where they can do irrigation and have regular supplies of water. I mean, it's biodiversity that people thought was lost has arisen because there's now moisture at certain times of the year. Streams and rivers that had dried up seasonally were no longer drying up seasonally. And this was sort of a landscape scale kinds of interventions. So this has inspired a lot of people, and there's a lot of efforts going on to do these kinds of landscape initiatives. The organization, I'll tell you a little bit about that. I've been working with the Landscapes for People, Food and Nature initiative. 2 years ago started to collect information about who was actually doing this kind of thing, this Ethiopia type of thing, who was trying to do it. This is definitely one that has the best documented successes. But we've now documented 365 initiatives around the world that are intentionally trying to increase agricultural production, conserve or restore critical ecosystem services and biodiversity, and are focused on livelihoods that have built coalitions of groups to do multi-pronged investment programs to work together to try to do these kinds of changes. And increasingly, those are getting support and in some cases funding because of their potential climate benefits, both on adaptation and mitigation. So some of the advantages then of thinking about this from a landscape scale is that you can actually negotiate least cost solutions. So, maybe one solution works in a part of the landscape, and, in another part of the landscape you want to do agroforestry, in another part of the landscape you want to do GMOs, in another part of the landscape you want to do watershed restoration, but you're strategic. You're looking at processes within the landscape and figuring out what's the most efficient way to get at what you want. It provides a platform for involving a lot of institutions moving in a particular direction. It allows you to select what's appropriate in terms of particularly mitigation interventions that make sense to local people, and only doing the things that make sense to them because of the co-benefits. It also allows you to start thinking about integrating climate action into your mainstream development programs. Climate as part of agriculture, climate as part of infrastructure, climate as part of energy, et cetera. And it also challenges you then to have large-scale climate benefits for both adaptation and mitigation. The other opportunity, which I think is still, we don't have the numbers very well for this, we have kind of models for it, but not really real numbers, is the potential economies of scale that come from the synergies of doing these things together. What we do know is there's huge inefficiencies by having completely separate forest development programs, water development programs, crop development programs, tree crop development programs that are being designed independently, drawing upon the same resources without any coordination among resources, et cetera. So there's a lot of experimentation going on right now with new models that would take advantage of some of these synergies, and et cetera. So I think the new paradigm, I think, that's emerging out of this is that rather than manage our different resources piece by piece by piece in independent ways and in independent spaces, it's a new model of saying, we have a shared land and water resource base. How are we as a society, how are we within this landscape going to decide how we're going to use that together? And it becomes a bit of a negotiated outcome. So we move here from single issue, single actor, small scale action, single actions, to multiple things going on, to actually starting having collaborative, integrated approaches which can manage the trade-offs and enable the synergies much more effectively than the other approaches can be. It is basically a kind of a negotiated approach. It's bringing the different stakeholders within the word landscape I'm using here to mean a socio-ecological system that has a history, a culture, it's a patterns of land use, of different kinds of land use that have a historical, cultural, ecological basis in a place, and that the groups that have an interest in those resources basically work together to try to, or at least are willing to sit together and pound out the differences they have between the different approaches. So when we're talking then about, that's a landscape. If you're talking about an integrated landscape initiative, which is a generational initiative, it's not a project, it's a process of managing the resource base in a landscape. And it involves basically 5 key features. It involves a commitment to long-term collaboration among different groups. It involves setting management objectives of the individual actors so that they have multiple functions. And farmers do this anyway here also. They're proud. They produce food, but they also protect biodiversity. Ranchers are out there protecting rangelands, and people are seeing the multiple functions that they have. They're rewarded for the multiple functions. They're respected as being stewards. The producers are respected for being stewards, and conservation stewards are encouraged to find ways to contribute to the economy and contribute to production. The third one is it's an approach that explicitly identifies the trade-offs that are going on and competitions within the landscape, and make explicit efforts to find solutions for those trade-offs, which sometimes means going up to the next scale. Trade-offs that can't be resolved at a plot level can sometimes be resolved at a farm level. Trade-offs at a farm level can sometimes be resolved at a community level. Trade-offs at a community level can sometimes be resolved at a landscape level. So it gives you more solution options in your toolkit for moving this. The fourth part is you need some kind of a governance system for, it can be very informal, it can be very formal, it takes many roles with participatory, adaptive management. And then you need to have market incentives and policy and regulatory structures that encourage this multifunctionality in the landscapes. One of the interesting things is that because this has actually been an imperative on the ground in so many places. They just have all these conflicts between these different uses. There's been rich innovation that's been happening, and we've now documented more than 87 different communities of practice that are doing landscape work, most of which started off with a different entry point. Their entry point was local land degradation, or their entry point was local watershed management, or their entry point was, I want to build a biological corridor through this production area. So all these different entry points. But what they found as they tried to work was that the other stakeholders who were involved didn't really want to get involved unless there was something in it for them as well. So the biological corridor people started offering credit programs for farmers. And then they couldn't get the water people to plant native species on the riparian area, so they built a watershed component into their, into their collaborative initiative. And lo and behold, 10 or 15 years later, these different programs that started off with different names and different entry points are looking sometimes very similar to one another, or have very many shared components. But it's highly fragmented, very poorly articulated with the policy environment, so it's been largely invisible or so confusing to policymakers because they have a different group coming to them every day with a different specific ask that they're not doing it. So that's basic. That's sort of the basic integrated landscape management. It's what they're trying to do in Australia in their drought-prone urban watersheds. They've got stakeholder platforms that are trying to work on these things. It's the kind of thing we're trying to do here with the Chesapeake Bay. How can we resolve the conflicts between farmers and biodiversity in that bay? Now there's an overlay of climate change adaptation and mitigation. And it's basically about integrated landscape management still, but it's being really strategic about the potential climate benefits that can also be generated from that system. And there are, I think, four particular items that need to be added on to many of the conventional landscape approaches when you really care about climate. One of them is specifically to look at climate-smart practices, which you, I think, already talked about today. The second one is because of the increased risk factors that are associated with climate change, mobilizing much more diversification across the landscape than you might otherwise do in a landscape planning process. A third one is that you deal with interactions across the landscape. The most prominent one so far has been the relationship between managing forest cover and managing agricultural cover in a lot of places, but there's many other aspects to that. Where and how do you build irrigation systems? Irrigation systems are hugely generative of greenhouse gas emissions, especially when they're not done well. And that can be done differently, but it requires coordination. And then a lot of attention to landscape resilience, making sure that people can get food every year, regardless of what happens with the climate, making sure that livestock can get access to feed every year, every season, regardless of what's going on with the climate. So creating systems of resilience within it. So in terms of climate-smart practices, the biggest issues, of course, are can you reduce emissions, which means these efficiency questions around inputs, but there's also the big one about sequestration. And I think we're way underplaying the potentials of transforming agricultural systems themselves, the production systems themselves. It means diversifying out of only annual grains and starting to use much more of our, getting much more of our livestock feed from perennial plants as opposed to from annual plants. It's growing boundaries around farms that will have multiple purposes in terms of conservation, but also being perennial features that can sequester and store carbon. It's about enriching soil carbon, improving microbial activity and nitrogen fixation. It's about more effective water management. It's about more effective feed systems and waste management systems for livestock. Almost all of these things that you do for climate have important co-benefits for livelihoods, have important co-benefits for production, important co-benefits for reducing costs. So it's really much of the world anyway, it's a win-win-win situation to be moving toward these climate-smart practices. The caveat to that is that many of them require a couple of years, 2 to 5 years, 2 to 7 years of investment before those profits start to be generated. And so there's a huge economic threshold problem in terms of providing the financing for switching to climate-smart agricultural practices. The diversification, what are some of the kinds of things that you're doing? You're really trying to do diversification as a risk reduction process, part because you just don't know what's going to happen with the pest, and you just don't know what's going to happen with the rainfall. So you just need to grow a greater diversity of things to make sure that at the end of the day you're going to be able to harvest stuff. You also want to make sure that you have reserves. You need reserves at the household level. You need reserves at the community level. You need reserves at the local level, and you need to have access to external reserves in the case of a real crisis situation. And you can do that by having, there's all sorts in the developing world, there's all sorts of plant crops that you can actually grow that just stay in the ground until you're ready to harvest them. There's famine foods that could be done. There's programs in Africa about making sure every household has multiple fruit trees in their household areas, so that year-round there's something that's always being produced, so that you always have some kind of a backup to your main agricultural system. So it's kind of a planning process like we do here for flood planning, flood protection, prevention or whatever. These are the things that you do to make sure your system is going to be in place. It also means you want to sustain habitat for as carbon stocks in these landscapes, which of course has all these other co-benefits as well. But it means you want to keep that. Regardless of how important and intensive your agricultural system is, you've got to have some land that's not in agriculture, at least some land that's not in annual crop production. Then there's the issue of managing interactions across land uses. A lot of this has to do with natural infrastructure, or even built infrastructure. So this is the idea of, if you're going to be investing in these perennial systems or these improved irrigation systems, you also need to co-invest in flood control structures or in watershed harvesting structures. You need to keep the mangroves to keep the seawater from intruding. So it's about co-investment, so that different parts of the landscape are ecologically or socially or economically supporting one another. You can also do this for increasing your mitigation benefits and securing your ecosystem functions. Because I think what was interesting for me when I was listening to Martina, and I am listening to this sort of this incredible scientific enterprise that's going on in terms of understanding how this genetic level of systems is going, and there literally is nothing like that going on in terms of the science for understanding how to make these ecosystems more functional, more resilient. It's just not being invested in. And yet there's incredible science out there. You mentioned the microbial piece, but incredible science out there about just making agroecosystems more effective by looking at improving the system's function. Some of them are high tech, but a lot of them are not. But we're not going there. We're not understanding hydrological systems. We're doing less monitoring of hydrology than we were doing 20 years ago. So I think there's a whole science challenge there as well. And finally, there are these other aspects of resilience, and we have a new paper that just came out that encourages people to look at 4 specific aspects of resilience. You want to look at the resilience of the agroecosystem. You want to look at the resilience of the ecosystem. You want to look at the resilience of livelihoods. So what happens when, as you know it will, the crops are going to fail? What's the system that's in place? Or if the crop's going to go down, there's a new pest, how are you going to handle it? And finally, institutional resilience, which is really not talked about. But this is having the institutions in place that start to mobilize when you need to mobilize, that have planned when you need to be planned. So I'll go through this kind of quickly, but if you're going to try to do, there are now a lot of initiatives all around the world trying to make these climate smart landscapes, or whatever they decide to call them. It does involve multi-stakeholder planning. It involves working on developing the governance, some kind of governance structure, and it's wildly varies everywhere you go, and looking at resource tenure issues. It means we've got to have a new way of getting coordinated financing mechanisms for both the short and long-term elements, and both on-farm and off-farm elements, in a way that's coordinated. And it means that our tracking systems shouldn't just be tracking the climate change, and they shouldn't just be tracking production, but they should be tracking they should be basically tracking these multiple functions in the landscape to figure out really what is a dashboard of a performance standard according to what people in that landscape have decided are the top priorities for their work. So I was just going to give you one quick example of one of the landscapes that we're collaborating with in southwestern Kenya. It's called the Kericho Mau area, and it's one of the mountains that's one of the most important water towers for Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, and also for East Africa. It's some of the last remaining large forested areas, so extremely important for biodiversity. These mountains, these higher level hills here are what's the last bit that's remaining. But it's also one of the most important commercial agriculture areas in East Africa. It's a very high productivity tea zone with both smallholder and largeholder tea groups that are going. But the system, everyone is worried about the system. The people in Nairobi are terrified about the disruption of water coming from this area. The tea producers are terrified about the invasion of crops and drought that's coming from massive deforestation. The forest and biodiversity people are terrified about the expansion of agriculture. So you've got now a situation where enough people are terrified that they are actually saying, yes, we've got to work together around this, what's going on in this area. And you have a very interesting kind of collaboration that's going on with the Kenya tea area and the tea processing groups becoming very involved with this, and the farmer organizations that are working with the tea industry. You have commitments from the multinational tea buyers to support this, and they are helping to support a process of Rainforest Alliance certification to improve the sort of environmental performance of the tea areas. And you now have a new initiative under the Sustainable Land and Water Program of the Sustainable Trade Initiative, sorry, lots of institutionals, that is now coming in with a sort of a fuller power of some of the international trade organizations to support what's going on in this landscape. And they're taking a couple of things. They're trying to upscale climate smart training for hundreds of thousands of farmers. This is really aiming to meet, I think it's about 500,000 farmers. Is the target, so it's not just a few. There's a big fuel issue because you actually need fuel for drying of the tea leaves, as well as for all the other purposes that you need bioenergy for in the area, and that's been a source of sort of pressure on deforestation. So they're introducing agroforestry, they're introducing woodlots, they're introducing improved forest management to deal with that. They're also trying to do a sort of a learning process from different stakeholder groups, and there were already existing local water resource user associations, forest associations, and you're now having the producer associations collaborating with these user associations to try to sort of see if they can make some substantial changes in the dynamics of what's going on in this very complex and very economically important and environmentally important landscape. And on top of that, they're all super worried about climate change and what it's going to do to tea production. So they're trying to build some elements of resilience. They're trying to build elements of buffering into the system with climate change. So I just have some beautiful pictures. Karicha is a very, very beautiful place. And you're starting to have the beginnings of a planning and coordination between the tea industry and the forest and water actors just kind of starting off, but it's sort of extraordinary because they've been merrily going in their completely separate ways for the last 20 years. It's been kind of funny. So that's what's sort of going on in the Mao. So let me just draw a couple of the conclusions that I have drawn at any rate about this, and that is that if we're really thinking about responding to climate change, in the land use sector, and that goes for agriculture, forestry, rangelands, whatever the land use sector is, adaptation is mitigation is livelihoods. And doing them together is the way to go. We got really distracted in the international community, separating adaptation and mitigation. It was just a total disaster for the land use sector. And you have a situation in places like Africa or Asia where, or places that really were not responsible for the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that really don't want to be held accountable for mitigation, but there's massive amount of mitigation co-benefits from most of these, from a high proportion of these adaptation programs, especially the ones that are about restoring degraded lands, waters, vegetation, et cetera, building agroforestry systems, building feed reserves for livestock, all these kind of things that just sequester carbon, stabilize, reduce degradation, et cetera. The second thing is that this multi-sector, cross-stakeholder approach is going to be really central to it. Because if you don't have it, what you generate is just conflict. And conflict reduces productivity, conflict reduces willingness to invest. Whereas having these kinds of opportunities for structured engagement and for structured planning and negotiating the trade-offs and making deals can actually make the system move more smoothly. I think if we want to have big impacts on the climate, it's not crop field by crop field, although obviously that's the building block. But our planning and our thinking about it needs to be happening at scales, and then we need really tight engagement and leadership from the farmers' organizations and community organizations having a very strong voice in these collaborative processes and not just being seen as sort of the objects of somebody's plan up in wherever it is. And I think one of the things for those of us who are involved in this is that landscape thinking. In a lot of ways, we absolutely need every bit of specialized skill. We need our specialized institutions. There's a reason sectors have their sectoralization. But they can't say, I'm responsible for food production. And that's really important, so I'm going to work on food production. That model, I think, is the 20th century model. It's not the 21st century model. So I'm a food production specialist. How can I contribute to a sustainable multifunctional landscape in a way that has as much food production as possible, but that also has either no negative effect or co-benefits for the others? How can I coordinate with them and bring my specialized expertise and my specialized interest within a framework that recognizes the validity of these other things, and that asks the question, is what I'm doing contributing to climate change mitigation and adaptation, and how could I do that more? So I think I'll leave on that little bit of preaching. Thanks.